A chill settles over the farmlands of central Wisconsin, the kind that nips at fence wire and makes the barns creak like old ships. Life here moves on deliberate rails. Chores at dawn, nods on Main Street, the hush of Sundays under steeples that point at a stern sky. Secrets in a place like this tend to be small and ordinary. Money worries, a quarrel, a bottle tucked where no one looks. Yet behind the door of one weather-worn farmhouse, a darker current gathered, slow as groundwater and just as patient. This is where the story of Ed Gein truly begins, not with the headlines, not with the legends he later inspired, but with the soil, the solitude, and a family that mistook fear for virtue. Wisconsin at the turn of the 20th century was stitched together by little communities, fields and wetlands. Houses stood far apart, and each home was its own small world. People minded their business. They worked, they prayed, and they did not ask questions they didn't want answered. In that quiet, isolation was easy to confuse with safety. Plainfield was one such village, a speck of storefronts and gravel roads set among marshes. The opera house doubled as dance hall, church, bar and theatre, depending on the night. A single building pulled duty for a dozen needs. On paper it reads wholesome. In practice, it meant that public life was modest and private life was absolute. Whatever you did inside your house was mostly your business, especially if your house sat a mile or two down a rutted track. Into this world came George and Augusta, children of German immigrants, opposites yoked by marriage. George Gein was broad-shouldered and adrift, good with his hands, weak with his will. Alcohol had a way of erasing his intentions. He could work, but he could not hold. One job bled into the next. Pride soured into bitterness. Augusta was the counterweight. Devout, iron-willed, certain. She had been raised on scripture that thundered about sin and consequence, and she carried that thunder into every room. Her piety was not gentle. It was a rule-book and a rod. They married in 1900. She opened a small grocery and kept the books with the same severity she brought to the Bible. He tried to be useful and lost ground to the bottle. The first child, Henry, arrived in 1902. The second, Edward Theodore, in 1906. Augusta had wanted a daughter she could shape into an emblem of purity. 2 sons felt like a test from God, so she set herself to passing it. Discipline became devotion, obedience, salvation. In Augusta's gospel, nearly the whole world was corrosive. Liquor, laughter in the wrong company, especially women outside her mirror. She cast temptation as a swarm and herself as the only clean space left. Publicly, the Geins looked like many families of the time, hard-working, sober in manner, reserved. Privately, the dominion was total. George slouched toward the periphery, nursing resentment and drink. When he did step forward, it was often with his hands, and the lesson he left was fear. Augusta's lessons came with chapter and verse. She favoured the Old Testament, the kindling wood of Scripture, floods and fire, wrath and wages. Tenderness seldom survived the sermon. From the beginning, Ed breathed that air. He was a quiet boy with a lazy eye and a soft voice, eager to please the one person whose approval mattered and rarely came. At school, a single-room building with a handful of students. He read well, kept to himself, and sometimes giggled out of nowhere, as if answering a thought that had tapped him on the shoulder. Children can be cruel in uniform ways. They found his strangeness and picked at it. He went home with the sting and learned quickly that tears had no currency there. The world outside mocked him. The world inside measured him. What Augusta called purity demanded walls. Friends were temptations. Neighbours were snares. The boys slept under sermons. The world outside, she warned, was gathering filth in every ditch. In that atmosphere, the ordinary awkwardness of adolescence did not find release. It curdled into shame. Ed learned to police his thoughts with a vigilance that bordered on ritual. He wanted to be good the way a drowning boy wants air, urgently, without ever quite getting it. The marriage between Augusta and George hardened rather than healed. Her contempt grew open. His authority collapsed into sulks and rages. Divorce was unthinkable to her. Endurance became its own theatre of righteousness. By the time the family left the city behind and moved to a 155-acre farm outside Plainfield, Augusta's will had become the gravity of the household. The choice of that farm was not about opportunity. It was about distance. A moat of fields and wind between her sons and a world she considered diseased. On that farm, time narrowed. Augusta sealed the boundaries. The marshes and fields finished the job. Ed could leave for school and supplies and not much else. Inside, rooms gathered dust around the Bible and the stove. Outside, seasons worked their old arithmetic, plant, harvest, freeze, and the boys followed along with calloused hands. Isolation has a way of amplifying whatever is already there. In this house, it amplified a mother's certainty, a father's failure, a child's need. A detail that matters. Authority in such homes was often celebrated as virtue. Strictness looked like care from the right angle. A strap across the table could be mistaken for moral backbone. When Augusta demanded vows of chastity from her sons, when she mapped sin onto nearly every human impulse, the town would not have seen an alarm. They would have seen seriousness. It is easy to miss the line where piety ends and obsession begins, when both wear the same clothes. Ed did not cross that line. He was raised on the far side of it. He tended the farm, read pulp adventures, and retreated further into an inner room no one else could enter. His brother Henry was older, a little bolder, sometimes a counter-voice, but even that narrow tether frayed. What Ed received, approval, meaning, the rhythm of right and wrong, flowed almost entirely from his mother. It is an unstable economy for any soul, much less one so solitary. By his mid-teens, school was over. That was common enough for farm boys then. The difference was that the farm for Ed was not only labour, it was jurisdiction. The rules were absolute and homegrown. The outside world, with its ordinary compromises and human traffic, grew more foreign each year he did not live in it. He could fix a fence in the dark and hardly speak to a stranger in sunlight. The habits of isolation deepened into identity. If this were a gentler story, the next chapter would be a loosening. The boys leaving, the father sobered, the mother softened by age. But this story moves in the other direction. George drank harder and worked less, a man disappearing in place. Augusta's doctrine calcified. The boys became men without the practice of being men. No courtship, no friendships to test and temper them, only chores and sermons and the long, tight silence of winter kitchens. There is a temptation, when we talk about monsters, to imagine a lightning strike, a sudden rupture that explains everything. With Ed Gein, the more honest picture is of a wick being slowly dipped and dipped again, the tallow accumulating in layers. The farm was the vat. The heat was constant. The contours of his later cruelties were not yet visible, but the shape of the vessel that would hold them already was. For now, the important thing is this. Before the headlines, there was a boy who learned that love arrived as judgment, that safety meant distance, and that obedience might purchase a blessing. In a house where tenderness starved and fear was dressed up as holiness, he chose the only strategy that seemed to work. Adhere to Augusta so closely that he could almost disappear into her shadow. The cost of that strategy would one day be counted in graves and ash. But that reckoning belonged to a future nobody in Plainfield could yet imagine. In towns like Plainfield, the map itself did part of the disciplining. Marsh to the east, timber to the west, a scatter of barns between. The Opera House could host a revival on one week and a barn dance the next. Morality and merriment shared a coat rack. People helped each other through blizzards and barn raisings, then retreated from each other's private storms. If a family kept to itself down a sandy road, folks assumed the reason was thrift, not terror. Doors stayed closed. Questions stayed polite. The era carried its own silences. Men did not speak of sadness. Women did not name their dread. Doctors tended broken bones and harvest wounds, not the bruises minds accumulate over years. When someone seemed off, the phrase carried both diagnosis and sentence. You coped in private. You prayed harder. You looked away. That cultural habit did not invent what happened in the Gein house, but it built the blind corners where it could happen undisturbed. So the stage was set. A severe mother whose certainty felt like law. A father fading into liquor and complaint. Two boys learning that love must be earned by shrinking themselves. Out of that geometry, the path forward narrowed. Ed would take it step by step, quietly, without spectacle. He did not yet know that the same seclusion that kept him safe would one day make him invisible long enough to do the unforgivable. He only knew the rule that governed his days: obey, withdraw, atone, repeat, and the winter wind that translated that rule into weather. The lights along Main Street clicked off one by one. Out on the farm, the wind moved through corn stubble, and the house settled on its haunches. Walls keep weather out. They also keep storms in. In that tight, pious quiet, a life was being shaped, one rule at a time, into a blade. Night fell, and the farmhouse held its breath with him. Calm. Life on the Plainfield farm was as harsh as it was monotonous. The house itself was weather-beaten and small, its wooden boards creaking against the Wisconsin wind. To most, it would have been nothing more than a modest farmstead, but inside, Augusta ruled with the authority of both preacher and tyrant. Her voice filled every corner of the house, quoting scripture and warning of damnation. To her sons, the outside world was filthy, crawling with sinners, and she alone could offer salvation. George, their father, faded into the background. His alcoholism worsened, and he rarely contributed to the farm or family. When he did, it was often with a raised hand or slurred words. To young Ed, George represented everything Augusta despised: weakness, vice, and failure. Augusta never hid her contempt, belittling her husband openly, and the children absorbed her judgment. George's occasional bursts of violence only deepened Ed's sense that the world beyond his mother's approval was hostile and unsafe. School offered little refuge. Ed attended a small, one-room schoolhouse with 12 children, but his awkward manner set him apart. He spoke with a lisp from a lesion on his tongue, and a growth on his eyelid made his gaze seem unsteady. He often laughed at odd times, as if amused by private thoughts. To other children, this was unnerving. He became a target of ridicule, his peers mocking his giggles and effeminate mannerisms. When Ed came home in tears, hoping for comfort, Augusta scolded him for seeking friendship with sinners. And George offered only scorn. This isolation drove Ed further inward. He found solace in books, adventure stories at first, then pulp magazines filled with strange tales. But every page he read was shadowed by Augusta's teachings. She told him that nearly all women, herself excluded, were harlots and tools of the devil. She warned that alcohol was a path to damnation, that intimacy was evil, and that obedience to God, and to her, was the only shield against hellfire. In such an environment, Ed's natural curiosities were twisted into shame. Even ordinary impulses were met with guilt and fear. One incident scarred him deeply. Caught in a private act of adolescence, Ed was dragged by Augusta into a storm of rage. She seized him, declaring that men's desires were the curse of mankind, branding him as filthy. The lesson was burned into him. Desire equaled sin, and sin equaled punishment. From then on, Ed associated even his most human urges with horror, forever tethering intimacy to fear. Ed's only consistent bond was with his older brother Henry, though even that relationship was complicated. 5 years older, Henry often acted more like a third parent than a sibling. He too had endured Augusta's suffocating control. But unlike Ed, he began to resist it. Henry worked hard on the farm, shouldered responsibilities their father abandoned, and at times pushed back against their mother's authority. He criticized her openly, and more dangerously, he began to criticize her to Ed. Henry told Ed that their mother was overbearing, that her hold on him was unhealthy. To Henry, Augusta was toxic, a force that crushed their chance at any normal life. But to Ed, Augusta was sacred. Hearing his brother speak against her felt like blasphemy. These conversations unsettled him deeply. Henry's words planted seeds of doubt, but they also created resentment. To Ed, his brother was no longer just family. He was a threat to the one person Ed idolized above all others. In April 1940, George died, his body finally giving out after years of alcohol abuse. He was 66, a man hollowed out by his own weaknesses. For Augusta, his death was confirmation of divine punishment. For Ed, it was another lesson. Sin led to ruin, and his mother's judgment was always right. With George gone, Augusta's influence grew even stronger. She ruled the farmhouse without opposition, and her sons remained bound to her will. By the early 1940s, Henry sought a way out. He began seeing a local woman, a divorced mother of 2, and spoke of building a life with her. To Augusta, divorce was sin enough, but the idea of her son living with a woman outside marriage was unthinkable. She condemned Henry's relationship, lashing out with the same fiery rhetoric she used on Ed. Henry pushed back, voicing his frustrations openly, even in front of his younger brother. For Ed, this was unbearable. He could not imagine a world where his mother was wrong, nor one where his brother turned against her. On May 16, 1944, the tension reached its tragic climax. That day, the brothers were burning brush on the farm, a routine task. But the fire grew out of control, and the volunteer fire department was called. When the flames were finally subdued, Henry was missing. Searchers fanned out across the property, and by nightfall, they discovered his body lying face down on the ground. At first, the cause seemed simple. Smoke inhalation and perhaps a heart attack. Henry had no significant burns. The coroner ruled it accidental, and the matter was closed. But questions lingered. Henry's body bore bruises on his head, marks that did not align with smoke or fire. No autopsy was performed, and no investigation pursued. The townspeople accepted the tragedy at face value. After all, Ed was quiet, polite, and seemed incapable of violence. But in hindsight, after Ed's later crimes came to light, suspicion grew. Had Henry confronted his brother once too often? Did Ed see in him not a sibling, but a rival for their mother's devotion? Some criminologists later called it the Cain and Abel moment of the case. If Henry's death was no accident, then Ed had already crossed the line from repression to violence long before the world realised. With Henry gone, Augusta's grip on Ed tightened further. He was now her only son, her only audience, and her only disciple. And Ed, already isolated and conditioned to obedience, leaned into that role with almost pathetic devotion. He remained on the farm, tending to chores, listening to sermons, and living entirely under Augusta's shadow. His world shrank further, his thoughts circling endlessly around his mother's teachings. The farmhouse grew quieter, lonelier, and darker. What had once been a family home was now a fortress of sermons, guilt, and fear. And in that fortress, Ed Gein's inner world grew stranger, more secretive, and more dangerous. December 1945. The cold in Wisconsin that year was bitter, the kind that silences birds and stiffens the soil into stone. Inside the farmhouse, Augusta Gein, matriarch, preacher, tyrant, lay dying after a second stroke. Her body had grown frail, but her authority over her youngest son had never loosened. Even in sickness she lectured, warning him about women, about sin, about the world outside their walls. Ed sat faithfully by her side, feeding her, cleaning, praying. He clung to her every word, as if each breath might be her last revelation. And then, on a bleak December morning, she was gone. The death of Augusta Gein was not just the loss of a parent. For Ed, it was the collapse of his entire universe. His father had already died. His brother was buried under questions. And now the one person he both feared and adored had vanished. She had been his compass, his measure of good and evil, his judge and redeemer. With her gone, the house did not simply grow empty, it became a tomb. Neighbours remember that Ed wept with inconsolable grief at her funeral. His despair seemed childlike, as if he had lost not only his mother but his reason for living. In truth, that was exactly the case. He was left with land he could barely manage, a house too large for one man, and an inner life that no longer had direction. The farmhouse itself reflected his fracture. Ed boarded up the rooms his mother had used, the parlour, the upstairs bedrooms, spaces where Augusta's presence lingered most strongly. Curtains remained where she had left them. Furniture sat untouched. Dust thickened like mourning cloth. Those rooms became shrines, sealed and preserved. Ed retreated into a small corner of the house, living mostly in the kitchen and a side room. It was as though he could not permit himself to inhabit the spaces she once commanded. The rest of the house froze in time, as if awaiting her return. Alone, Ed fell deeper into isolation. He continued to perform small chores for neighbours, fixing fences, babysitting, doing odd jobs. People described him as polite, shy, even helpful. He was regarded as eccentric but harmless, a quiet bachelor who still seemed like a boy in his mother's shadow. Yet behind closed doors, his solitude festered. He began to read obsessively. His tastes drifted from adventure stories to pulp magazines filled with tales of crime, death, and anatomy. Detective magazines, stories of cannibal tribes, lurid accounts of atrocities. At the same time, he read about headhunters and ancient rituals in National Geographic, fascinated by practices of preserving and honoring the dead. To Ed, these stories were not just entertainment, they were education. He collected scraps of ideas, symbols, and fantasies that merged with the emptiness Augusta's absence had left behind. Loneliness deepened into obsession. Ed did not date, did not court women, did not seek companionship. In truth, Augusta's sermons had burned too deeply. He feared women, distrusted them, believed they were corrupt. And yet, he longed for his mother's presence. He longed for her voice, her authority, her company. The paradox tormented him. He wanted her, but she was gone. He could not resurrect her, but he could not let her go. This torment began to shape his behavior. Ed visited local cemeteries at night. Under the moonlight, he wandered among headstones, sometimes attending funerals during the day to study the bodies lowered into the earth. He later confessed to exhuming graves, though how many remains uncertain. He claimed he sought women who resembled his mother, middle-aged and matronly. From their remains he tried, in his own twisted way, to rebuild the figure he had lost. To Ed, this was not desecration, but a form of devotion. He spoke of it later with a strange calm, describing how he wanted to bring his mother back. In his mind, death was porous, a barrier that could be breached with enough ritual and effort. The line between grief and madness blurred until it no longer existed. The farm itself mirrored his descent. The kitchen where he lived grew cluttered, foul-smelling, filled with discarded food and magazines. Tools lay scattered, knives dulled by misuse. Yet the boarded-up rooms upstairs remained clean, untouched, sacred. The contrast was stark. Chaos in his living space, preservation in hers. It was as if Ed split the world into two halves, one where he descended into filth, and another where she lingered in sanctity. Outside, the townspeople saw little. They thought of Ed as odd but not dangerous. He helped when asked, paid his bills, kept mostly to himself. He was known to laugh inappropriately, to drift into strange stories. But rural life often tolerated such eccentricities. Few wondered what loneliness might be doing to him behind closed doors. Fewer still imagined the rituals he had begun to enact under the cover of night. When he looked at his mother's sealed rooms, Ed felt her absence like a physical weight. In his solitude, that absence grew unbearable. He searched for ways to fill it. Magazines fed his imagination. Cemeteries fed his compulsion, and the farmhouse became a workshop of grief. Slowly, methodically, he slipped further from reality. It is tempting to call this madness sudden, but the truth is more patient. Ed had been trained his whole life to obey, to suppress, to live through another's will. When that will vanished, he had no structure left. His acts were not eruptions but responses, grief expressed in the only ways his mind could grasp. He could not let Augusta go, so he sought her reflection in the dead. He could not accept the silence, so he tried to manufacture her presence. This was the period when Ed began creating what authorities would later find artifacts of horror made from human remains. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the scale of his actions was still small, almost secretive. He lingered at the edge of visibility, his reputation in town still that of a strange but helpful neighbour. The gap between the public Ed and the private Ed widened, but no one yet saw how deep it went. Looking back, the signs were there. His refusal to socialise, his fixation on his mother, his unsettling laughter, his strange reading material. But in a community where privacy was valued and eccentricities overlooked, those signs blended into the landscape. No one intervened. No one asked. Ed Gein's life after Augusta's death was a spiral, from isolation into obsession, from grief into desecration. What began as devotion became distortion, and what was meant to honour his mother became an unspeakable betrayal of others. Yet for years it went unnoticed, hidden behind boarded windows and polite smiles. By the early 1950s, the stage was set. The farm stood silent, its parlour frozen in time, its kitchen a nest of decay. The man who lived there moved between neighbours' chores and midnight wanderings, between the face of harmlessness and the acts of the macabre. Augusta was gone, but in Ed's mind, she had never truly left. He would not allow her to. And so, night after night, he returned to the cemeteries, shovel in hand, chasing shadows of the woman who had ruled his life. The town slept, the marshes froze, and Ed Gein listened to the silence, waiting for the voice that would never return. By the early 1950s, the town of Plainfield regarded Ed Gein as little more than a local eccentric. He was the quiet bachelor down the road, polite enough, often willing to do odd jobs for neighbours. He mended fences, babysat children, and even hunted with the men on occasion. He lived simply, or so it seemed. His farm was shabby but serviceable, his manners shy but courteous. In a small community where everyone carried quirks, Ed blended in as one of those harmless figures people spoke of with faint amusement. But the truth inside the Gein farmhouse had grown darker than anyone dared imagine. Augusta's rooms remained sealed, dust thickening on her memory. Ed's own spaces had rotted into filth. Among the garbage, magazines piled high, and scraps of cloth, he worked on grotesque projects. What he had begun as nighttime visits to cemeteries expanded into something more ambitious. He had moved from exhuming graves to creating trophies, human remains reassembled, preserved, shaped into household objects. Police would later discover chairs upholstered with human skin, bowls carved from skulls, and masks fashioned from the faces of the dead. To Ed, these were not trophies in the way killers boast of their conquests. They were, in his fractured mind, attempts to capture presence. He longed to be close to women who resembled his mother, to inhabit her body, to feel her strength. His grim workshop became a theatre of impossible resurrection. In town, whispers about Ed's strangeness circulated. Children mocked him, called him weirdo. Women sometimes avoided his stare, which lingered too long. But when Ed laughed inappropriately or rambled about strange topics, most chalked it up to loneliness. Few saw him as dangerous. The very fact that he still helped neighbours lulled them into complacency. They saw his shabby figure and his awkward smile, and assumed oddity was the worst of it. But the boundary between Ed's fantasies and reality was collapsing. In November 1952, a Plainfield tavern owner named Mary Hogan disappeared. Her bar was left deserted, her blood found on the floor. Locals speculated about robbers, drifters, or foul play by someone passing through. For a long time, no one connected her disappearance to the quiet bachelor on the farm. When Ed occasionally joked in town, saying things like, "Mary's not missing, she's at my place," people laughed, assuming it was his strange humor. No one took him seriously. Behind the boarded windows, the truth was unspeakable. Ed had murdered Mary Hogan and brought her body back to his farmhouse. Her remains, like those of the women he exhumed, became part of his grotesque experiments. To him, she was not simply a victim, but another vessel through which he sought his mother's form. For years after Mary's disappearance, life in Plainfield resumed its rhythm. Ed continued his odd jobs, visited neighbors, kept to himself. The suspicion never fell squarely on him, but his compulsions grew stronger. He read more, fantasized more, and worked tirelessly on projects that would horrify the world when they were finally uncovered. Neighbors sometimes visited the Gein farm, describing it as unkempt and unpleasant. Dead animals lay about, and Ed's home smelled of decay. But such neglect wasn't unheard of in rural poverty. Again, people looked away. To question too deeply would mean crossing boundaries of privacy that the community rarely breached. Yet Ed's mind was moving further into a place where fantasy demanded flesh. His reading fixated on true crime magazines, anatomy guides, and pulp stories about atrocities. He clipped articles, saved images, pored over every grotesque detail. Slowly, a ritual formed. He would visit cemeteries, exhume, experiment, and then retreat into the fantasy of becoming his mother. He made suits stitched from human skin, masks to wear, corsets fashioned from torsos. To Ed, these acts were not expressions of cruelty, but desperate imitations of closeness. He wanted to transform himself, to dissolve into Augusta's shape. It was a ritual of grief carried to its most violent conclusion. And yet for the people of Plainfield, Ed remained the quiet man who babysat their children and ran errands for their households. The split between his public face and his private horrors grew wider, more grotesque, and still no one bridged it. The community's blindness was not malice but habit. People in Plainfield minded their own business. They valued privacy, accepted eccentricities, and assumed danger always came from outside. The man patching their fences, the man fixing their tools, the man laughing nervously in the general store. He was invisible, hidden in plain sight. By the mid-1950s, Ed's obsessions could no longer be contained by graveyards alone. He craved fresher subjects, more immediate flesh. The line between grave robber and killer dissolved entirely. When he looked at women in town, shopkeepers, waitresses, widows, he no longer saw neighbors. He saw pieces, symbols, possibilities. The farm had become his world, his laboratory, his sanctuary, and his prison. Every object crafted from the dead testified to a grief that metastasized into atrocity. And still, the town turned away. The disappearance of Mary Hogan should have been a warning, but it was not. It was dismissed, a footnote in rural gossip. That dismissal gave Ed time, and time gave him space to expand his darkness further. The stage was set for what would come next, a crime so brutal, so grotesque, that it would finally tear away the curtain shielding Plainfield's quiet bachelor. It was November 16th, 1957, the first day of deer season in Wisconsin. In Plainfield, the hardware store run by Bernice Warden opened its doors as usual. Bernice, a widow in her 50s, was well known in town, respected, hard-working, plain-spoken. That morning, her son, Frank, a deputy sheriff, had left early to go hunting. Bernice remained at the shop, keeping the register and greeting customers. By evening, she was gone. The store sat empty, the cash register missing, and a trail of blood stained the floor leading out the back door. Frank returned at dusk to find the shop deserted and his mother vanished. Panic seized him. He knew at once this was no robbery by drifters. His mind snapped to a single suspect, Ed Gein. Frank remembered Ed visiting the shop the day before, asking about buying antifreeze. He recalled the uneasy feeling Ed often gave, the way he lingered too long in conversation, his awkward laughter. And now, with his mother missing, Frank connected the dots. He alerted the sheriff, and the investigation began. That night, authorities drove to the Gein farmhouse. The place stood in darkness, isolated by acres of frozen fields and marsh. The deputies entered with flashlights, expecting perhaps to find Bernice alive or evidence of her abduction. What they discovered instead was a scene so grotesque that seasoned officers staggered back in horror. Inside a shed, they found Bernice Warden's body, hung upside down, gutted like a deer. Her head had been severed, her body emptied, treated as if it were game. It was an image no one present ever forgot, one that scarred the town's memory forever. The farmhouse revealed even more horrors. As deputies searched through the clutter, their lights caught things that defied comprehension. Bowls made from human skulls, chairs upholstered in human skin, a wastebasket sewn from flesh, masks, human faces carefully removed and preserved, hung on the walls. A belt fashioned from nipples, a box of preserved female genitalia, organs stored in jars. It was as if the house itself had become a museum of atrocities, assembled piece by piece over years of grave robbing and murder. The discovery was so far beyond ordinary crime that officers struggled even to describe it in reports. Many broke down or vomited. Hardened men, used to hunting accidents and farm injuries, were reduced to shaking silence. They had walked into the living space of a man whose grief and obsession had transformed into an unholy workshop. Ed was arrested that night at a neighbour's house. He went quietly, without resistance, as if he had been expecting it all along. At the station, he sat mild-mannered, cooperative, almost cheerful at times. He admitted to killing Bernice and to grave robbing, describing his actions with a detached calm that unsettled investigators. To him, these acts were not monstrous. They were practical, even devotional. He said he wanted to create a woman's suit, to crawl inside it and become his mother. The town of Plainfield convulsed with shock. People who had trusted Ed with their children now realized he had been crafting furniture out of corpses. Women he had known in life had been desecrated in death. For decades, Plainfield had seen him as eccentric but harmless. Now they learned he had been living among their dead, harvesting their bodies, turning grief into grotesque ritual. Reporters descended, and soon the entire country was transfixed. The details spilled across headlines, each revelation more lurid than the last. America read about the bowls, the masks, the lampshades, and recoiled. Ed Gein became the face of horror itself. His crimes blurred the line between murder, madness, and myth. He was no longer just a recluse from Plainfield. He was a symbol of the darkness that could lurk unnoticed behind a neighbour's polite nod. And yet, when people in town remembered him, they still described the same things. He had been quiet, helpful, even gentle. The dissonance between the man they knew and the monster revealed inside his house was unbearable. Some refused to believe it. Others could not speak of it at all. But the evidence was undeniable. Bernice Warden's death had ripped open the door on a nightmare that had been festering for years. And in doing so, it forced Plainfield, and the entire country, to confront the possibility that evil could grow not only in cities or battlefields, but in the most ordinary of places, in the most ordinary of men. Ed Gein's trial, his sanity, and the legacy of his crimes would become the next chapter. But the night of November 16th, 1957, marked the point of no return. The secrets of the Gein farmhouse had been laid bare. What lay within was not just crime. It was a portrait of grief mutated into horror, a reminder of how silence, isolation, and obsession can twist a man beyond recognition. The arrest of Ed Gein sent Plainfield into shockwaves that never truly ended. Reporters swarmed the town, photographers crowded the courthouse, and headlines screamed words like butcher, ghoul, madman. What had been a quiet farming community was suddenly the epicenter of America's darkest story. The images described in police reports, lampshades of human skin, masks made from faces, were almost too grotesque to believe. Yet they were real, and they demanded explanation. Ed himself, under interrogation, offered none that satisfied. He admitted freely to killing Bernice Warden. He also confessed to the disappearance of tavern owner Mary Hogan years earlier. As for the rest, the masks, the furniture, the grave robbing, he spoke with unsettling detachment. He said he visited cemeteries in daze-like states, sometimes taking bodies, sometimes simply wandering. He described crafting a woman's suit from human skin so he could, as he put it, become my mother. He did not flinch as he told these stories. He did not seem to grasp their horror. The legal system struggled with how to handle him. In January 1958, a judge declared Ed Gein unfit to stand trial. He was diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia and committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Later, he would be transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he would spend the rest of his life. For the people of Plainfield, this was both a relief and a burden. Relief, because they would never have to face the spectacle of a full trial, never have to hear the evidence recited in open court. Burden, because the mystery remained unresolved. If Ed was insane, how much did he know of what he was doing? Was he calculating or lost? Was he victim as well as villain? These questions haunted the community. The Warden family demanded justice. Frank Warden, Bernice's son, could never reconcile the fact that his mother had been slaughtered and desecrated in such a way, only for her killer to be declared unfit. To him, and to many, Ed Gein had escaped punishment by hiding inside madness. Yet others saw him differently. Psychiatrists painted him as a man broken by an abusive childhood, twisted by isolation, driven by delusion. They noted how completely he had been dominated by his mother, how Augusta's death had shattered his already fragile mind. They described him less as a monster than as a tragic product of cruelty and neglect. The truth, perhaps, lay in the uneasy space between. Ed Gein was both victim and victimizer, both lost child and calculating criminal. His story forced Americans to look at the murky overlap of crime and illness, of morality and madness. Meanwhile, his farmhouse became a macabre symbol. Crowds of onlookers gathered, eager to glimpse the place of horror. Tourists posed at the fence, daring each other to peer inside. Souvenir hunters scavenged the property, stealing bits of wood or scraps of debris. The town grew weary of the attention. Plainfield, once proud of its modest obscurity, became infamous as the home of the Butcher of Plainfield. In March 1958, the Gein farmhouse itself was set for auction, its contents to be sold. On the night before the sale, a fire broke out, consuming the house completely. By the time firefighters arrived, the structure was beyond saving. Some believed it was arson, a final attempt to erase the horror. Others thought it was an accident. Ed, when told, shrugged. "Just as well," he said. The house, like the man, was too stained to survive. Even after he was locked away, the shadow of Ed Gein spread. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists seized on the story. His crimes became the seed for fiction. Norman Bates in Psycho, 1960. Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. And Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Each character was different, but all carried fragments of the Plainfield ghoul. Popular culture turned him into archetype: the rural recluse, the flesh-wearing madman, the monster hidden in plain sight. For the people of Wisconsin, this was another wound. They resented seeing their tragedy sensationalized, their grief mined for entertainment. Yet they could not stop it. Ed Gein had become a myth as much as a man, his crimes forever etched into America's imagination. Inside Mendota, Ed lived quietly. He worked as a janitor, played checkers, ate meals in silence. Staff described him as polite, even friendly. He showed no aggression, no outbursts. He was, in many ways, the same mild man Plainfield had always known, except now, his world was bounded by hospital walls. He lived out his days in obscurity, the storm he caused raging outside while he drifted calmly inside. He died in 1984 at the age of 77, buried beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery. His grave was later vandalized repeatedly, his name stolen from the stone. Even in death, the fascination with Ed Gein did not fade. The trial that never happened left a void. There was no verdict, no sentence, no closure. Only the facts of his crimes, the scars on his victims' families, and the stories that grew in their wake. Ed Gein never faced a jury. Instead, he became a mirror in which America saw its darkest fascinations: madness, violence, and the fragile line between the two. The story of Ed Gein did not end with his arrest, nor even with his quiet death behind the walls of a mental hospital. In many ways, it began there. His crimes, more than those of nearly any other killer, reshaped the cultural imagination. They became raw material for novels, films, and nightmares, symbols through which America explored its fear of the hidden and the grotesque. Plainfield, once anonymous, became infamous. Its name carried the weight of horror. Locals bristled whenever reporters arrived, seeking quotes about the ghoul. Residents avoided speaking of Ed, as though silence might smother the infamy. Yet his legacy clung to the town, etched into its identity. Tourists wandered cemeteries, hunting for his grave, photographing his mother's plot, buying cheap souvenirs. For those who lived there, it was a humiliation. One man's madness reduced their community to a sideshow. The farmhouse, burned to ash, left behind only memory. But in memory, the image persisted. A crooked house on the prairie, its rooms filled with grotesque relics. That image travelled far, into literature and cinema. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho transformed Ed's devotion to his mother into Norman Bates, the quiet motel keeper haunted by maternal dominance. Toby Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre distilled the farmhouse into a slaughterhouse of cannibals, with Leatherface wearing masks of human skin. Decades later, the silence of the lambs echoed him again in Buffalo Bill, stitching a suit from flesh. Each version reinvented him, but the root was the same. The quiet man in the quiet town, hiding horrors too great to imagine. Why did Ed Gein strike such a chord? Perhaps because he blurred the boundary between the ordinary and the monstrous. He was not a gangster, not a career criminal, not a stranger prowling city alleys. He was the neighbour who fixed your fence, the man who bought groceries from your store, the babysitter of your children. He was the kind of person people overlooked, precisely because he seemed unremarkable. And from that unremarkable figure emerged a darkness so shocking it felt impossible. Ed Gein became, in essence, the embodiment of the question: what do we truly know about those around us? His story suggested that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles politely. Sometimes it lives next door. And yet, to call him only evil risks missing the complexity of his tragedy. Ed was shaped by cruelty long before he inflicted it. Raised in suffocating piety, crushed under an overbearing mother, deprived of love and freedom, he became a man incapable of forming healthy ties. His grief metastasized into obsession, his loneliness into ritual. This does not excuse his acts. Nothing could. But it explains how the seeds were sown. His story is not one of sudden transformation, but of decades of silence, repression, and blindness. The victims deserve more than to be eclipsed by his myth. Bernice Worden was a mother and a business owner, murdered brutally in her own shop. Mary Hogan was a tavern owner with a sharp wit, remembered for her laughter. The countless unnamed women whose graves he desecrated were mothers, daughters, sisters. Their identities were stolen, reduced to fragments of Ed's obsession. They must be remembered as people, not just as parts in a murderer's fantasy. When Ed Gein was buried in Plainfield Cemetery in 1984, it was as if the soil itself refused peace. His gravestone was stolen, chipped, vandalized until eventually removed entirely. Only an unmarked plot remains. Visitors still leave flowers, coins, or graffiti at the site. Some come out of morbid curiosity, others to exercise their own fascination. Even in death, he has not been left behind. His legacy endures not because of who he was, but because of what he revealed. He showed the danger of unchecked isolation, the consequences of silence, the cost of turning away from those in pain. He exposed how a community, by ignoring oddities and excusing strangeness, can allow darkness to fester unseen. Today, when people speak of Ed Gein, they often speak of his influence on horror. But underneath the cinematic myths lies a smaller, sadder truth. A boy who wanted his mother's approval. A man who could never let her go. And a world that never asked enough questions until it was too late. The Plainfield farmhouse is long gone, but the cemetery where Ed once wandered is still there. His story continues to be remembered, less as a legend and more as a reminder. Sometimes danger doesn't look dangerous at all. It can look like the quiet neighbour who seems polite, helpful, and easy to overlook, until the truth finally comes out. That is the legacy Ed Gein left behind. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories, and as always, stay safe.